To Malcolm X, the desecration of the mosque and the associated violence demanded action, and he used what Louis X, later Louis Farrakhan, later called his "gangster-like past" to rally the more hardened of the Nation of Islam members to take violent revenge against the police. Malcolm X sought Elijah Muhammad and #039's approval, which was denied, stunning Malcolm X. Malcolm X was again blocked by Elijah Muhammad when he spoke of the Nation of Islam starting to work with civil rights organizations, local black politicians, and religious groups. Louis X saw this as an important turning point in the deteriorating relationship between Malcolm X and Muhammad. Rumors were circulating that Muhammad was conducting extramarital affairs with young nation secretaries, which would constitute a serious violation of nation teachings. After first discounting the rumors, Malcolm X came to believe them after he spoke with Muhammad and #039's son Wallace and with the girls making the accusations. Muhammad confirmed the rumors in 1963, attempting to justify his behavior by referring to precedents set by biblical prophets. Over a series of national TV interviews between 1964 and 1965, Malcolm X provided testimony of his investigation, corroboration, and confirmation by Elijah Muhammad himself of multiple counts of child rape. During this investigation, he learned that 7 of the 8 girls had become pregnant as a result of this. He also revealed an assassination attempt made on his life, through a discovered explosive device in his car, as well as the death threats he was receiving, in response to his exposure of Elijah Muhammad. Remarks on Kennedy assassination. On December 1, 1963, when asked to comment on the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Malcolm X said that it was a case of chickens coming home to roost, he added that chickens coming home to roost never did make me sad, they and #039 always made me glad, likewise, according to the New York Times. Further criticism of Mr. Kennedy, the Muslim leader cited the murders of Patrice Lumumba, Congo leader, of Medgar Evers, civil rights leader, and of the Negro girls bombed earlier this year in a Birmingham church. These, he said, were instances of other chickens coming home to roost. The remarks prompted widespread public outcry. The Nation of Islam, which had sent a message of condolence to the Kennedy family and ordered its ministers not to comment on the assassination, publicly censured their former shining star. Malcolm X retained his post and rank as minister but was prohibited from public speaking for 90 days. Malcolm X had by now become a media favorite, and some nation members believed he was a threat to Elijah Muhammad and #039's leadership. Publishers had shown interest in Malcolm X and #039's autobiography, and when Louis Lomax wrote his 1963 book about the nation, When the Word is Given, he used a photograph of Malcolm X on the cover. He also reproduced 5 of his speeches but featured only one of Muhammad and #039's, which greatly upset Muhammad and made him envious. Departure from Nation of Islam. On March 8, 1964, Malcolm X publicly announced his break from the Nation of Islam. Though still a Muslim, he felt that the nation had gone as far as it can because of its rigid teachings. He said he was planning to organize a black nationalist organization to heighten the political consciousness of African Americans. He also expressed a desire to work with other civil rights leaders, saying that Elijah Muhammad had prevented him from doing so in the past. Activity after leaving Nation of Islam. Malcolm X and #039's only meeting with Martin Luther King Jr., March 26, 1964, during the Senate debates regarding the eventual Civil Rights Act of 1964. After leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X founded Muslim Mosque Incorporated, MMI, a religious organization, and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, OAU, a secular group that advocated Pan-Africanism. On March 26, 1964, he briefly met Martin Luther King Jr. for the first and only time, and only long enough for photographs to be taken, in Washington, D.C., as both men attended the Senate and #039's debate on the Civil Rights Bill at the U.S. Capitol building. In April, Malcolm X gave a speech titled "The Ballot or the Bullet," in which he advised African Americans to exercise their right to vote wisely but cautioned that if the government continued to prevent African Americans from attaining full equality, it might be necessary for them to take up arms. In the weeks after he left the Nation of Islam, several Sunni Muslims encouraged Malcolm X to learn about their faith. He soon converted to the Sunni faith. Pilgrimage to Mecca. In April 1964, with financial help from his half-sister Ella Little Collins, Malcolm X flew to Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, as the start of his Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca obligatory for every Muslim who is able to do so. He was delayed in Jeddah when his U.S. citizenship and inability to speak Arabic caused his status as a Muslim to be questioned. He had received Abdul Rahman Hassan Azzam and #039's book The Eternal Message of Muhammad with his visa approval, and he contacted the author. Azzam and #039's son arranged for his release and lent him his personal hotel suite. The next morning Malcolm X learned that Prince Faisal had designated him as a state guest. Several days later, after completing the Hajj rituals, Malcolm X had an audience with the prince. Malcolm X later said that seeing Muslims of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans, interacting as equals led him to see Islam as a means by which racial problems could be overcome. Visit to Cairo. Malcolm X had already visited the United Arab Republic, a short-lived political union between Egypt and Syria, Sudan, Nigeria, and Ghana in 1959 to make arrangements for a tour of Africa by Elijah Muhammad. After his pilgrimage to Mecca in April 1964, he visited Africa a second time. He returned to the United States in late May and flew to Africa again in July. During these visits he met officials, gave interviews, and spoke on radio and television in Egypt, Ethiopia, Tanganyika, Nigeria, Ghana, Guinea, Sudan, Senegal, Liberia, Algeria and Morocco. In Cairo, he attended the second meeting of the Organization of African Unity as a representative of the OAAU. By the end of this third visit, he had met with essentially all of Africa and #039's prominent leaders, Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, and Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria had all invited Malcolm X to serve in their governments. After he spoke at the University of Ibadan, the Nigerian Muslim Students Association bestowed on him the honorary Yoruba name Omawul, and #039, the son who has come home, and #039 Winky Face. He later called this his most treasured honor. Malcolm especially hated Moise Tshombe of the Congo as an Uncle Tom figure. In a 1964 speech in New York, he called Tshombe the worst African ever born and the man who in cold blood, committed an international crime, murdered Patrice Lumumba Tshombe and #039's decision in 1964 to hire white mercenaries to put down the Simba Rebellion greatly offended Malcolm, who accused the mercenaries of committing war crimes against the Congolese. France and United Kingdom. On November 23, 1964, on his way home from Africa, Malcolm X stopped in Paris, where he spoke in the Salle de la Mutualité. After his return to the United States, he accused the United States of imperialism in the Congo by supporting Tshombe and his hired killers as he called the white mercenaries. X accused Tshombe and the American President Lyndon B. Johnson of sleeping together. When I say sleeping together, I don and #039 mean that literally. But beyond that, they and #039 in the same bed. Johnson is paying the salaries, paying the government, propping up Tshombe and #039's government, this murderer X expressed much anger about Operation Dragon Rouge, where the United States Air Force dropped in Belgian paratroopers into the city of Stanleyville, modern Kisangani, to rescue the white Belgian hostages from the Simbas. Malcolm X maintained that there was a double standard when it came to white and black lives, noting it was an international emergency when the lives of whites were in danger, making Dragon Rouge necessary, but that nothing was done to stop the abuses of the Congolese at the hands of Tshombe and #039's hired killers. X charged that the Congolese have been massacred by white people for years and years and that chickens come home to roost. A week later, on November 30, Malcolm X flew to the United Kingdom. On December 3 he took part in a debate at the Oxford Union Society. The motion was taken from a statement made earlier that year by U.S. presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue." Malcolm X argued for the affirmative, and interest in the debate was so high that it was televised nationally by the BBC. In his address at Oxford, Malcolm rejected the label of "black Muslim" and instead focused on being a Muslim who happened to be black, which reflected his conversion to Sunni Islam. Malcolm only mentioned his religion twice during his Oxford speech, which was part of his effort to diffuse his image as an angry black Muslim extremist which he had long hated. During the debate at Oxford, he criticized the way the Anglo-American press portrayed the Congo crisis, noting the Simbas were portrayed as primitive cannibalistic savages who engaged in every form of depravity imaginable, while Tshombe and the white mercenaries. Malcolm X charged that the Cuban émigré pilots hired by the CIA to serve as Tshombe and #039's Air Force indiscriminately bombed Congolese villages and towns, killing women and children, but this was almost never mentioned in the media, while the newspapers featured long accounts of the Simbas raping white women, molesting nuns. Likewise, he felt the term mercenary was inappropriate, preferring the term hired killer and that Tshombe should not be described as a premier, as he preferred the term cold-blooded murderer to describe him. Malcolm X stated that what he regarded as the extremism of the Tshombe government was never referred to as extremism because it is endorsed by the West, it is financed by America, it and #039's made respectable by America, and that kind of extremism is never labeled as extremism. Malcolm X argued this extremism was not morally acceptable since it and #039's not extremism in defense of liberty. Many in the audience at Oxford were angered by Malcolm X and #039's thesis and his support for the Simbas who had committed atrocities, with one asking, "What sort of extremism would you consider the killing of missionaries?" In response, Malcolm X answered, "It is an act of war." I and #039d call it the same kind of extremism that happened when England dropped bombs on German cities and Germans dropped bombs on English cities. On February 5, 1965, Malcolm X flew to the United Kingdom again, and on February 8 he addressed the first meeting of the Council of African Organizations in London. The next day he tried to return to France, but was refused entry. On February 12, he visited Smethwick, near Birmingham, where the Conservative Party had won the parliamentary seat in the 1964 general election. The town had become a byword for racial division after the successful candidate, Peter Griffiths, was accused of using the slogan, "If you want a nigger for a neighbor, vote Liberal or Labour." In Smethwick, Malcolm X compared the treatment of ethnic minority residents with the treatment of Jews under Hitler, saying, "I would not wait for the fascist element in Smethwick to erect gas ovens." Return to United States. After returning to the U.S., Malcolm X addressed a wide variety of audiences. He spoke regularly at meetings held by MMI and the OAAU, and was one of the most sought-after speakers on college campuses. One of his top aides later wrote that he welcomed every opportunity to speak to college students, He also addressed public meetings of the Socialist Workers' Party, speaking at their militant labor forum. He was interviewed on the subjects of segregation and the Nation of Islam by Robert Penn Warren for Warren and #039, 1965 book Who Speaks for the Negro? Throughout 1964, as his conflict with the Nation of Islam intensified, Malcolm X was repeatedly threatened. In February, a leader of Temple No. 7 ordered the bombing of Malcolm X and #039's car. In March, Muhammad told Boston minister Louis X, later known as Louis Farrakhan, that hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off. The April 10 edition of Muhammad Speaks featured a cartoon depicting Malcolm X and #039's bouncing, severed head. On June 8, FBI surveillance recorded a telephone call in which Betty Shabazz was told that her husband was as good as dead. 4 days later, an FBI informant received a tip that Malcolm X is going to be bumped off. That same month, the Nation sued to reclaim Malcolm X and #039's residence in East Elmhurst, Queens, New York. His family was ordered to vacate, but on February 14, 1965, the night before a hearing on postponing the eviction, the house was destroyed by fire. On July 9, Muhammad Aid John Ali, suspected of being an undercover FBI agent, referred to Malcolm X by saying, anyone who opposes the Honorable Elijah Muhammad puts their life in jeopardy. In the December 4 issue of Muhammad Speaks, Louis X wrote that such a man as Malcolm is worthy of death. The September 1964 issue of Ebony dramatized Malcolm X and #039's defiance of these threats by publishing a photograph of him holding an M1 carbine while peering out of a window. Assassination. On February 19, 1965, Malcolm X told interviewer Gordon Parks that the Nation of Islam was actively trying to kill him. On February 21, 1965, he was preparing to address the OAAU in Manhattan and #039's Audubon Ballroom when someone in the 400-person audience yelled, "Nigger! Get your hand out of my pocket." As Malcolm X and his bodyguards tried to quell the disturbance, a man rushed forward and shot him once in the chest with a sawed-off shotgun, and 2 other men charged the stage firing semi-automatic handguns. 211, Malcolm X was pronounced dead at 3:30 p.m., shortly after arriving at Columbia Presbyterian Hospital. The autopsy identified 21 gunshot wounds to the chest, left shoulder, arms, and legs, including 10 buckshot wounds from the initial shotgun blast. One gunman, Nation of Islam member Talmadge Hayer, also known as Thomas Hagen, was beaten by the crowd before police arrived. Witnesses identified the other gunmen as Nation members Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson. All 3 were convicted of murder in March 1966 and sentenced to life in prison. At trial, Hayer confessed, but refused to identify the other assailants except to assert that they were not Butler and Johnson. In 1977 and 1978, he signed affidavits reasserting Butler and #039's and Johnson and #039's innocence, naming 4 other Nation members of Newark and #039's Mosque No. 25 as participants in the murder or its planning. These affidavits did not result in the case being reopened. Butler, today known as Muhammad Abdul Aziz, was paroled in 1985 and became the head of the Nation and #039's Harlem Mosque in 1998. He maintains his innocence. In prison, Johnson, who changed his name to Khalil Islam, rejected the Nation and #039's teachings and converted to Sunni Islam. Released in 1987, he maintained his innocence until his death in August 2009. Hayer, who also rejected the Nation and #039's teachings while in prison and converted also to Sunni Islam, is known today as Mujahid Halim. He was paroled in 2010. In 2021, Muhammad Abdul Aziz and Khalil Islam, formerly Norman 3X Butler and Thomas 15X Johnson, were exonerated from their murder convictions, following a review that found the FBI and the New York Police Department withheld key evidence during the trial. On July 14, 2022, Aziz filed suit in the U.S. District Court in Brooklyn against the City of New York, seeking $40 million in damages related to his wrongful imprisonment. The Life of Malcolm X claimed that the assassins were members of the Nation of Islam, who fired the shotgun, Leon Davis, and Thomas Heyer. Funeral. The public viewing, February 23 to 26 at Unity Funeral Home in Harlem, was attended by some 14,000 to 30,000 mourners. For the funeral on February 27, loudspeakers were set up for the overflow crowd outside Harlem and #039's 1,000-seat Faith Temple of the Church of God in Christ, and a local television station carried the service live. Among the civil rights leaders attending were John Lewis, Bayard Rustin, James Forman, James Farmer, Jesse Gray, and Andrew Young. Actor and activist Ossie Davis delivered the eulogy, describing Malcolm X as and quote, "our shining black prince, who didn't and #039 hesitate to die because he loved us so end quote." There are those who will consider it their duty, as friends of the Negro people, to tell us to revile him, to flee, even from the presence of his memory, to save ourselves by writing him out of the history of our turbulent times. Many will ask what Harlem finds to honor in this stormy, controversial and bold young captain, and we will smile. Many will say turn away from this man, for he is not a man but a demon, a monster, a subverter and an enemy of the black man, and we will smile. They will say that he is of hate, a fanatic, a racist who can only bring evil to the cause for which you struggle. And we will answer and say to them, did you ever talk to Brother Malcolm? Did you ever touch him, or have him smile at you? Did you ever really listen to him? Did he ever do a mean thing? Was he ever himself associated with violence or any public disturbance? For if you did, you would know him. And if you knew him, you would know why we must honor him. And, in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves.